pleased to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Let me first thank Ambassador Phillips and his wife Kate for their generous sponsorship of this program. And at a time when our shared geopolitical future seems so uncertain, and when the threats on the global stage are more complex than ever before, the Phillips Family International Lecture Series provides our new community with an invaluable opportunity for informed discussion led by some of our nation's brightest policy minds across the political spectrum. Over the course of this program's history, we've been honored to host such luminaries as Bob Gates, Mitt Romney, Condoleezza Rice, and Carl Eichenberry to learn more about America's role on the international stage. These conversations have both broadened the perspectives of our students and faculty and contributed to the extraordinary work of the American Grand Strategy Program, which is training the next generation of geopolitical leaders here at Duke. Tonight's program, as we all know, is particularly timely, as anyone following the news understands that the world's eyes are on the plate. With that in mind, I should take this moment here to express my outrage at the gravely unjust Russian invasion of Ukraine and profound sadness at its tragic unfold. President Putin's military incursion has already cost hundreds of lives and displaced 500,000 refugees from their homes. It flies in the face of international law and is a gross violation of Ukraine's national sovereignty. We condemn this senseless invasion and we stand with the Ukrainian people. Our most important responsibilities in this moment of great suffering are threefold. First, we're providing outreach and care to Duke students, faculty, and staff who are members of the Ukrainian community. We're also mindful of the impact this unjust war is having on students and scholars in Ukraine. And we offer our solidarity and are seeking options to support them. Finally, we're committed as an academic community to better understanding the conflict and provide what support we can for a peaceful solution that restores and respects Ukraine's rights to self-governance. This mission of research and understanding is what brings us together tonight. There is perhaps no one better qualified to shed light on these issues than tonight's speaker, Ambassador Michael McFaul. A leading expert on Russia, American foreign policy, and global democratic development. Ambassador McFaul served for 5 years in the Obama administration as a special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council, and for 2 years as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation. Ambassador McFaul is currently a professor of political science at Stanford University, the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies, and the Peter and Helen being senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He serves as an international affairs analyst for NBC News and as a columnist for the Washington Post. He's also authored several books, most recently From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador McFaul and tonight's moderator, Dr. Peter Feaver.
Dave and Kay, Ambassador Dave and Kay Phillips, for their gift. For this, they're very sorry they can't be here. They're in Florida, but this is an issue that's near and dear to their hearts. Dave was on one of the first student exchanges to Russia in 1961. Traveled all around Ukraine, and then was ambassador to Estonia. So he's been following this issue for a long time, as I know you have. You went to college and graduate school in the late 80s. And the 80s are back. So, so let's talk about that. Tonight, what I want us to do, and by the way, thank you for coming. I know everybody wants you, and Duke got you. So thank you. I have 3 questions. Where are we? How did we get here? And where are we going from here? So pull those out. But begin with your situation report. What do you think is the most important things at this moment in the crisis? What catches your eye as most significant?
Well, first, Peter, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me back. You're right. I have over 80 invitations to speak around the country right now. And I have I've been, since COVID, I've been on some family trips, but I've only taken 2 trips for work. One was to go to Geneva with our NBC team to cover the summit when President Putin and President Biden met there. By the way, I'll be back on NBC. I'll be covering the State of the Union tonight, and they told me not to be late, so we cannot go late here tonight. I'm going to be part of the team. And the only other trip I've taken for work is right here with you. I'm a huge Stu fan. After Stanford, it's the best university in the country. So where are we at? So we're at a very scary moment. Joking aside, people know me as a Russia person, and I've spent a lot of time living in the Soviet Union, writing about Russia. A lot of you probably don't know that I've also worked a lot on Ukraine over my career. I published my first book about Ukraine in 2006. And at Stanford, we have run a training program for mid-career people, democratic activist types. Started it in 2005. I think we probably have over 300 alums now. And we hosted President Zelensky. I hosted President Zelensky in August, the first Ukrainian president ever to come to California. He came to Stanford because of this relationship we have with his country and this program. And I'm telling you that because I'm in touch with Ukrainians, I mean, literally just right before we walked in here. And I want you to know a couple of things. First, we're going to get about how we get there in a minute, but on the ground report, they are overwhelmed with pride at how their president has performed and how their military has performed, and now how other people are taking up arms to perform, including, by the way, professors who are taking off their ties and learning how to shoot guns, literally as we speak. People I know personally never shot a gun before, now are practicing how to shoot guns. They're proud of what has happened so far. The initial plan of attack that Putin had in place did not work. It was supposed to be a shock and awe. It was supposed to scare them away. The army was supposed to flee. Zelensky was supposed to go to Poland, and they were just going to walk into Kiev and put one of their people in place. And that didn't work. And you can see that it didn't work if you watch Vladimir Putin. I've known him for a long time. We met in 1991. I've written about him. I wrote my first article about him in March of 2000, where I said we need to worry about this guy undermining democracy there. I interacted with him for 5 years in government when President Obama and Vice President Biden and other members of our government would see him from time to time. I got to watch him. And of course, I follow his words closely. And you can hear it in his voice that he is frustrated with what's happening. So much so that just a couple of days ago, he did something unprecedented. He's threatened nuclear war. You know more about history than I do, so you tell me if there are other times in history that's happened. But that tells you that Plan A did not go well. And so Ukrainians on the ground feel good about that. But now we switch to Plan B. It's a plan we've seen before. It's what he did as prime minister in Chechnya in 1999. It's what they did in Aleppo in Syria after they intervened there in 2015. And looking at the weapons that they are assembling and the kinds of weapons they are assembling and what we've already seen in Kharkiv, and probably while we're sitting here right now, because I haven't seen news for a couple hours, is happening in Kiev, is a much different kind of war. It's a war that will involve killing lots of civilians on purpose. These are not accidents. When I hear, I'm pretty active on social media, follow me at McFaul. And when I hear sometimes from my critics, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What aboutism about the injustices that my country has committed and the evil that my country at times has committed? Yes, we have. I want to be crystal clear about that. We have not been angels and we have not made good mistakes. But to compare this to actual mistakes of military operations that we have done that have killed civilians, it's different because this is designed intentionally to terrorize the Ukrainian population so that they will submit to this occupation. And that's the moment we're in right now. That convoy, you've all seen it on TV. It's rolling into Kiev. There's going to be another one coming up from the south. What we don't know, I want to be clear, is whether it will be full-scale attempt to occupy the city right away, or whether they will try to squeeze the city by surrounding it. I would say there's a debate among military experts, people with 4 stars or former 4 stars that I interact with pretty regular basis that are debating that. So I don't think we know that for sure, but it'll be some combination, and that's the moment we're about to enter. And I would say one more thing, we're about to enter it as there are lots of reports from Ukrainians that I interact with that they're running out of key supplies already.
The Ukrainians. Right?
Yes, the Ukrainian military, they're running out of Stingers. They're running out of javelins. They're worried that they are not prepared for this onslaught. And one last thing on term kind of sit rep, right? Situational rep report here. Remember, there's a lot of asymmetry in terms of capabilities between the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. Putin has invested for 20 years in building up this conventional forces. His particular advantage is in the air. Ukraine does not have the means to fight that. And that tragically is what Ukrainians on the ground are worrying about. They're worrying about the air campaigns, the rockets and the planes that will try to seize and take care of Kharkiv, the number 2 city, second largest city, and then Kiev, of course, the capital.
So I don't want to get into the ancient history. We will go there, but just help us understand how the last week went so different from what Putin expected, but candidly, what the U.S. government expected as well. So the U.S. estimates, so far as we know, were not as optimistic about Ukraine's defense capabilities. So why have the Ukrainians fought so hard and so well? And why couldn't Putin have anticipated that?
It's a great question. I think we'll be asking that question for years and years to come. We start with Putin first and then Ukraine. And I could go way back, but I want to get to a lot of their questions. But remember a couple of things about Mr. Putin. He sees the world in black and white terms. There's autocrats and Democrats. He would use a different language, but he sees the world that way. We are the #1 enemy for him. This is a proxy war about us for him. That's part of it. It's not the whole part, but that's part of it. This is a proxy war for him. And over time, I want to say, I met him in 1991. I watched his career. I want to be clear about this. He has changed. Vladimir Putin today is not the person I knew in 1991. His ideas have become, more fixed. And by the way, that happens with age, right? It happens with all of us, I think. But it most certainly has happened with him. And it was true when I was ambassador to Russia. I arrived in Russia right as he was seeking re-election for his 3rd term. And right before, literally 2 weeks before I arrived, there were massive demonstrations against him because there had been a falsified vote. And as I arrived, his propaganda machine blamed me for those revolutions. Causation is not correlation, right? For the political scientists, that was an accident. But they blamed me, and twice in meetings that were not, I was just the note taker, right? But in 2 separate meetings, once with Secretary Kerry and once with National Security Advisor Tom Donilon, he was talking to, Secretary Kerry, you're Secretary Kerry for a minute, right? And he stares at you like this, by the way. And I don't know if you've seen, he sits like this. And I can get into that. So I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, so I'm not going to get into that, but he has a particular way of doing things, and body language is really important. And he's talking to Kerry across that table. You seen that big table where Macron's down at the other end, and I was at that table with Kerry, and he's talking away, and then all of a sudden he turned to me, and he looked at us, and he said, and he's completely ignoring Kerry, and he just stared at me like this, and he said, "We know what you're doing here, and we're going to stop you." And I want to be clear. We were not fomenting revolution in Russia. That was not President Obama did not send me there to do that. But I'm using that anecdote so you understand how paranoid he is about the outside world, about us, and in his mind, we put in power this regime.
But he was always thus. So you're saying he's more thus now?
Yes, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but so then he went on a run. In his mind, right? And by the way, there's some evidence to support that. This is his fifth war, not his first war. Chechnya, 1999. Georgia, 2008. Ukraine, 2014. Syria, 2015. Every time he has used force, he has achieved his objectives. And so I think he thought, I'm on a run. I know how to use military power. America, we're all divided. We're all fighting amongst ourselves. We're the declining power, right? And his buddy Xi Jinping's telling him that too. So I'm going to go for it. By the way, Peter, it reminds me of the late Brezhnev period, right? Because you'll recall, most of you won't recall. It's so fantastic, by the way, to see so many students here. I want to applaud how many students are here, because sometimes at Stanford, students don't come to these events. I really respect the fact that we have so many students here. So thank you for being here. Well, and that comment is going to get me in trouble back at Stanford, I just realized. Go Stanford! But remember, let me tell you, Brezhnev had a similar thing, right? He'd been in power for 20 years. That's a bad thing, by the way. The longer you're in power, the less you listen to your advisors. You think you know everything. And that's most certainly true about Putin. We can talk more in detail about that if you're interested. But he went on a run too. Marxist-Leninist regimes were falling all over the place. In Indochina, Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, then Nicaragua. It seemed like that this is a Soviet term, correlation of forces were on their side and we were in decline, allegedly. And then that's when he made that fateful decision. Okay, I'm running the table, I'm going into Afghanistan. And we know how that story ended. This reminds me of that. So that's my explanation about Putin and not underestimating. The second thing I would say is, and I need to be sensitive here, I'm going to try to be careful. But there is some folklore in Russian society about the passive, soft Ukrainians. Myagki. I need myagki if you speak Russian, right? We're these tough guys. They're not going to fight. They're peaceful people. And by the way, they are peaceful people. That's what's so tragic about this horrific war. All they want is to live in peace. But I think that stereotype was part of it. And then the third piece about Putin, and I want to get to the Ukrainians and to Zelensky in particular. If you repeat your propaganda and repeat it over time, you start to believe your propaganda, right? So if you watch Russian television, guessing most people don't hear, but I do, so I can report to you. What is your image of Ukraine? Your image is failed state, taken over by Nazis, and the people of Ukraine just really want to be united with their Slavic brothers in Russia. And I think there was a part of that in his mind that this would be an easy thing. And he's been mistaken on that. The last thing I would say on that, I think I talked about capabilities, and the Russians have all the capabilities are on their side. But wars are not just about capabilities. Wars are about will. And I think he grossly overestimated the will of his people. I just last night watched probably 4 dozen videos Russian soldiers that are captured in Ukraine. And what do you see when you listen to these young men? First of all, they're from rural societies, not very well educated, poor. That should resonate with you when you think about who joins militaries, right? So they're living in an information bubble that the Russian state creates for them. And they're saying the same thing. They thought this was going to be a cakewalk and that everybody was going to celebrate that they were there. And the Ukrainians put in front of them, you know what they do? They ask them to call their mothers. It's very powerful. Call your mom. They put the cell phone in front of them and their mother gets on, and you can imagine what your mother is going to say. Oh my God, Volodya, what are you? I can't believe you're there. They're crying. They're very emotional videos. I'll tweet out the link if you want to see it. I'll do that later tonight. And they're like, the main question they ask is, and I'm not going to use the language that they use, but why in God's name are you there? Why are you there? And of course, they have no answer. They have no, what is the threat? Where is this NATO monster? And that will piece, I think you got wrong. On the Ukrainian side, I would just say, sorry, I've gone on so long. I would say two things. Like I said, I hosted President Zelensky last August. I spent about 5 hours with him. A very impressive guy. I knew some of the people that were running against him. I know the leaders who are against him. And I just would remind you, for those who don't follow Ukrainian politics closely, that there was a lot of skepticism about whether he would be a good president. Before this war, there was a lot of people saying he wasn't up to the task. And by the way, there were some Western leaders and some Western officials and some people in our government that had a bit of an arrogance towards him. He was just this troublemaker, that he was just, all this NATO talk, why are you getting in the way of that? I wrote a piece, I read a column for the Washington Post, as was your president talked about. My next one will be out tomorrow, by the way. I wrote a piece saying, we've got to stop talking about the US-Ukrainian, this is in August of last year. I said, we've got to start talking about this US-Ukrainian relationship as is we're giving them stuff and they're like the poor recipients receiving our economic aid, receiving our military training. I would say there's some little colonial, our history better than I do, Professor. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I hear it sometimes the way some of my friends in Washington talk, if the Ukrainians could just get their act together and they should be grateful for what we're giving. And I wrote the opposite. I say, stop framing it that way. What is the one country in the world fight? This is before this war, folks. This is last summer. What's the one country in the world fighting Putin's Russia? It's Ukrainians. They back then were providing security for us. So stop framing this as it's some, we're the principal and they're the agents, they're the neo-colonial relationship. Stop framing that the way they have done this. And I got a lot of blowback. The reason I'm telling you that is I got a lot of blowback from probably some of the people you and I both know saying that is so wrong. Or why, the Ukrainians are unhelpful. They're unhelpful. That's a word you hear. And I just want to say two things. I don't know what the future holds for President Zelensky, but that is one badass leader of Ukraine. I've watched his videos and I've seen the things he said. Just literally last night, we were talking about it earlier. I was in touch with somebody that's quite close to him. And, these are people in Kiev, literally, getting ready to die. I mean, they're getting ready to die. They're getting ready to fight, but they're worried about dying. And this mutual friend of ours, I was like, maybe it would be better for him to move to Lviv. I mean, you don't want your president to be killed or captured. And we had this kind of rational back and forth strategy kind of conversation. And then, this was all via text. He said, Mike, this is abstract, of course, because there's no way Zelensky's leave. There's no way he's going to leave. He's a remarkable leader. And then I'm sorry to go on about this, but remember when you're fighting for your homeland, it's a little different. remember how it felt in our country on September 11th? For those of you who had to live through that, there's a spirit that comes with that makes you feel invincible and makes you think that you can do certain things. And I think that helps explain why Putin's war has not gone as well as he thought.
You may have already answered this, but it's striking to me that the Russians, who prided themselves in their information warfare capacity, their ability to operate on the information domain as well as the kinetic domain, are 2, 3, 4 steps behind the Ukrainians in just on the information warfare aspect of this. Did that surprise you? How ham-handed they've been and how adroit the Ukrainians have been?
It's a great question. And I think it's a good segue to also talk about how it's going inside Russia, right? The information war there. No, it didn't surprise me because Ukraine is a democracy. And so they have a pretty rough and tumble press. They've been at war, remember, they've been at war for 8 years. This is just the escalation. And you learn, by the way, we could learn some things from the Ukrainians about fake news and disinformation and those things that I think are having a really corrosive impact on our society. They've learned how to deal with that. They have some pretty sophisticated NGOs, for instance, that work on that. I think it's the flip side. It's that the Russians believe their own propaganda. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not interacting with people in Donetsk and Mariupol. Odessa, I am, actually. I just was talking to somebody in Odessa last night. So I don't want to pretend I know how the whole card is playing. But one thing I am convinced of, and there was even data to support this before the war, Putin assumes that if you're ethnically Russian, or that Russian language is your first language, that you're going to be pro-Putin and pro-Russian. And that's the part he doesn't understand about Ukraine. Zelensky's first language is Russian. He grew up in the East. And I think he misses that point. I think he looks at his numbers there and he thinks that, am I holding this in the
I
wrong
don't know.
place?
They're working on it in the back there. So.
Do you want me to switch? I can switch that with that one if you want.
Yeah, let's try that. Now.
Hold that away so it doesn't. There we go. Testing. Okay. It's me that's the problem. It's not the microphone.
So you've been walking close to Putin.
Yeah, at least turn off my phone in case that's doing something.
That could well be.
Could be. Let's see. Maybe that'll work better.
Aha. You didn't take that phone.
No, correlation is causation, but no, this is a new phone. This is definitely
Not a gift from
he keeps an eye on me too. So. I forgot where. Oh, disinformation. I do think maybe they have believed their own information. But the next, the other, I didn't finish the sit rep on Russia because I know you want to get to the future. But I think there's one more important piece. Let's just dig a little bit into what's happening inside Russia.
Right, especially, is he under pressure from within his regime?
Yes.
Putin.
So far, I would say no. But there's been some cataclysmic changes in Russia in the last 7 days. First, not unlike a lot of Americans, by the way, and not even unlike some Ukrainians, they didn't believe that he was going to do this. They honestly thought that he would never go this far. And so they're in shock that he did this. They thought it was going to be a little skirmish, they recognize the two people's republics or whatever. They never had thought that it would go this far. And they never thought that we would go this far in terms of sanctions. They are completely shocked by that. Completely shocked by that. And these sanctions are affecting really rich people, but it's affecting millions of people in Russia. And they are feeling that isolation. And I say, thank God. I was just on a Russian show, television show, opposition channel. It's called Doj TV, if you know it. And the moderator yesterday was saying, isn't this horrible that we have sanctions? And I said, horrible? I said, Slava Bogu. That's how you say thank God in Russian. And she was really jarred by that. She's like, well, Michael, what did I do wrong? And I said, and I hate to say this because I've always been a supporter of targeted sanctions, but it's no longer sufficient. And I said, look, you just can't pretend you're on the sidelines anymore. There is good and evil in the world, folks, and you've got to take a stand. And yeah, it's dangerous to protest. I got it. I don't want you to be arrested either. But we can't like pretend that we can just hope this is all going to go away. And it got a little tense. My assistant just sent it to me. 1.3 million views on YouTube already. That 5-minute clip, and that tells you a little bit that the info ops that they're running inside their country. I'm enemy number one in Russia. Let's be clear. In terms of this stuff, it is a moment of courage just to click like for anything I say in Russia. And I tell you that caveat, that anecdote, because I do feel there is a shift. Already, several prominent oligarchs have already fled. Now, they're trying to save their own money. They want to say no so that we'll allow them to transfer their bank accounts to the West. I got it. But I think there's something happening inside. And even you asked about his elite. Of course, I do not have interaction with them. I'm on the sanctions list in Russia, so I can't travel there right now. Proudly on the sanctions list, by the way. But all those national security guys, council guys, Putin held this meeting. It was this very strange meeting where he basically told each one of his members of the National Security Council to say that you're with him. It was quite extraordinary. It actually reminded me of communist days and Stalin, demanding loyalty. And when he got to the head of what would be the equivalent of our CIA, so head of intelligence abroad, his name's Narishkin. This guy was shaking, by the way. He was nervous, and he stumbled, and he said, "Are you with me?" I can't remember exactly. You have to say Imya Nochesva, his name and middle name. I'm forgetting what it is right now. And he said, "Yeah, yes, Mr. President, I am." And then he said, "Say it more clearly." And he said, "Yes, I'm for the annexation of the two republics." And Putin said, "That's not what we're talking about." And you idiot. We're talking about recognizing them as independent countries. And they said, "Yes, I'm for that." And he used the wrong verb tense. He didn't use the definitive verb tense. And he interrupted and he said, use the different verb.
State it more clearly.
State it more clearly. And he was shaking. And I tell you that anecdote because people fear Putin. All those people, they fear him. But I think he's lost their respect. I really do. I think this has been such a cataclysmic failure already for them and for their kids and their grandkids, by the way, right? Their grandkids are not going to be able to go to Duke anymore. That's what they're thinking about. That's exactly what they're thinking about. They're not going to be able to go to the French Riviera anymore for their holidays. They're not going to be going to St. Bart's anymore. They're thinking about how it affects their personal lives. And they're saying, and I talked to one of these people over the weekend, somebody who's known Putin for 30 years. He's in these circles, right? And he was just like, he's ruined our lives forever. This is not an opposition, this is like inner circle elites. They call them they even have a phrase for it in Russian. It's the top 1,000, right? So they even have a phrase. It's a kind of a slang word for them. He's ruined their futures. And so that doesn't mean they're going to resist. That doesn't mean there's going to be a palace coup overnight. But will they rally to him? Will they support him? I actually think this will be a seminal moment, not just in the history of Ukraine and what happens there, but also in Russia.
You say that they still fear him. It strikes me that at least in the West, one of the most incredible pivots over the last 72 hours or more has been a shift from we can't do that, lest we can't confront Putin because bad things will happen if we do, to we must confront Putin or bad things will happen. That what happened is Putin lost a lot of his deterrent power, at least over the West, which has got to be psychologically very disturbing to him. But let me move you now to.
I agree. I completely agree. And That needs to be, that's probably another lecture, another day about how Europe is being, I think there's a renewal and a rebirth in Europe that is moving rapidly, and he did not anticipate that.
You didn't have 100 billion euro plus up to the German defense budget on your budget, your bingo card?
Definitely did not have
I
that.
didn't have it on mine either. Okay, ancient history, how we got here. There's a view very prominent in academic circles, friends of ours who have made a living, advancing the view that this is our fault for pushing NATO, rubbing the defeat of the Soviet Union in the face of the Russians and threatening Russia by expanding NATO. What's your view on that?
Thank God we invaded NATO. That's my first view. Because you need, as we say in academia, think of the counterfactual. Think if we were in a world without NATO right now. Think about all those ethnic Russians in Estonia. Think about what would be happening on the Ukrainian-Polish border right now. When Ukrainians get to the other side, they know they're safe. So, those that make that argument, I'm going to get into why that argument is wrong in many, many ways. I could spend the rest of our time talking about how it is, but I won't. Instead, what I'll do, I just wrote a piece about it in the Journal of Democracy. Those that want to get into the nitty-gritty of the history, you can go see it there, because we wanted to wrestle with the empirical record, and I want to do a few sound bites from that in a minute. But you have to ask. I just had this argument with a journalist a few hours ago. And this is, I'm now speaking to the young people thinking about careers in public service and policy. It's one thing to be against a policy, but you have to say, well, what are you for? Well, what are you going to do instead? It's so easy. And I went through this shift. You went through this shift. It's one thing to be a professor and saying that's a bad policy, but then when you're sitting at the White House, you have to have a policy. You can't just say, well, we shouldn't do that. And I think this is a brilliant illustration of they're not thinking about what the world would have looked like had NATO not expanded. This would look much more like, with many more countries being threatened instead of Ukraine. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say, data matters, history matters. The problem, and let's just be clear, one of the people we're talking about is a guy named John Mersheimer. John and I and another colleague, Steve Sustanovich, we participated in a roundtable set of articles in Foreign Affairs in 2014. I'm just saying this for our students. Go look it up and see who's right and wrong about Putin. By the way, while I got the chance, go back and read John's article from the end of the Cold War, when he predicted the return of war in Europe. It's in a journal called International Security. See, I know my facts. 1990. And then I want you to read, put it together, an article that I wrote with a colleague, Jim Goldgar, International Organization, 1992. And I'm telling you this in part because there's not enough accountability in our profession. If you're in this, I just had this conversation with one of my scientist friends because we were considering somebody for an appointment, and it came up, well, this person's been wrong about 4, 5, and 6, and 7, and 8, but they're really still a really great analyst. And my scientific friend said, well, if you're wrong that many times in my part of the campus, our campus is separated, right? He said, we wouldn't be considering this person for a job at Stanford right now. And
all I can say is thank God for tenure.
Fair point, me too. But I want to come back to NATO really briefly. One, we both wrote our pieces in 2014. You can go and check it out and then judge for yourself. But here's the cherry picking of history that goes on in those that make that argument. One, they don't think of the counterfactual. Two, they forget the periods of cooperation over the last 30 years. If NATO expansion was such a horrible thing, then it should have been a horrible thing all the way through. But that's not the actual historical record. 1997, right after the first wave, go read the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Go see what Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, was saying about their cooperation with NATO. 2000, go see what Vladimir Putin said about NATO when he was visiting London as acting president. He said, I think it's a great organization. We should join. Don't believe me? Go look it up. Or buy my book and find the quotation there. You can find it there. I write about it there. Go and see what he said about the Ukraine NATO Council. So it's a good idea. Countries should have the right to choose what alliances they want. Now hold on. If this is the cause of this, how do you explain those statements? Or go look up the NATO summit in 2010, Portugal. I was there with President Obama.
Which is after the offer was extended to Ukraine in 2008.
That's right. Thank you for reminding me. Yes. Key point, right? The Bucharest summit. 2 years later, we're at the Lisbon summit. It's the NATO summit, folks. It's not the APEC summit. It's not the UN General Assembly. It is the NATO summit. All the leaders are there. And Dmitry Medvedev is there too. And you don't need to believe my account. I could tell you the private account a little bit if you're interested. When he met with Obama, just go look at what he said. He was proposing that we cooperate on missile defense. Now hold on. John Mersheimer wants you to believe that NATO, they've just been fighting, and then finally, Putin just had to invade because he couldn't take it anymore. And yet, that's a bad theory if you can't explain these periods of cooperation, right? So I think it's wrong. The heart of the matter is not NATO expansion. The heart of the matter is democracy expansion. What has threatened Putin was Georgia 2003, the Rose Revolution. You could go back to Serbia 2000 if you want, but really Georgia 2003, the Orange Revolution in 2004, the massive demonstrations against his regime in 2011, the Arab Spring. I sat in the room and we argued this during the Arab Spring. That's what threatens him. And what he's trying to roll back tonight is not NATO expansion. He's trying, and don't believe me, listen to what he says, folks. He says it clear as day. Sometimes I wonder, does Professor Mersheimer actually read what Putin says? I'm sorry for that, John. I didn't mean that. That was not fair.
Equal time.
That was not fair. No, not equal time. You can give him a little time, not equal. There's too much false equivalency these days. I'm just joking, John. No, but seriously, look at what he said. I listened to his entire speech so that you didn't have to. I listened to his entire speech, 58 minutes, rambling speech, explaining what this war is about. He got to NATO at like minute 42. It was like an afterthought. What he said to the people and to his soldiers is we're doing two things. We're going to destroy Ukrainian military, and then we're going to do, and this is his words, not mine, denazification. We are going to roll back what he calls the neo-Nazi coup from 2014, supported by the United States of America. That is his military objective. That's what threatens him. A democratic Ukraine threatens his own legitimacy, his own standing back home, because he tells his people, we're a different people. We're not like the West. Can I tell one more anecdote?
Well,
Or not? Okay.
Because I want to ask a different critique.
Okay.
A Republican.
I was going to tell you about his meeting with Biden in 2011. We'll come back to that. That's a teaser for somebody who wants to ask a question.
I think you may be able to do that with this question. There's two Republican critiques that I want you to address briefly. One is, well, if we had been tougher in 2014, he would have gotten the message. The other is, well, if Trump were still president, he would have. Both of those arguments have some prominence in the punditry world. So what's your views on those two?
I don't think it's just punditry. I think there's some presidential candidates making those arguments, including one who used to be the president. I just testified before Congress last week, and the Republican witness, Ambassador Rick Grinnell, was there, and he made that second argument, I think 14 times. So it's a real, they're both important arguments. The first one is more important in my view. I think they're right. I think there's something to that.
The 2014.
Well, I want to start with 2008. It's very convenient to start with 2014.
Fair enough.
Very convenient. If you're a Republican, very convenient to start with 2014. I want to start with 2008. That's when Putin invaded Georgia. That's when George W. Bush was president. Guess how many? I'm looking at my students. I want to guess how many Russians were sanctioned after 2008 invasion. 300, 400, 500, 3,000. Remember, this is George W. Bush. Yes, zero, sir. You're right. Zero. Zero. And all this stuff, you know, oh, we're weak, we're weak, we're weak. I don't think anybody accused your old boss of being weak about using force. This notion that because Obama was weak in Syria, he invaded in 2014. Whatever your views of George W. Bush, I don't think anybody would consider him afraid to be strong. But that's what happened then, and we didn't do anything about it. Now I'm getting guts. We thought we came in 7 months later. By the way, we debated this, and it was like, so the tough guy George W. Bush didn't send, didn't do X, Y, and Z. By the way, also did not send lethal assistance. And now we're supposed to 7 months later do this. And we debated it. And, I think I write about these in detail in my book. And by the way, my book is not a whitewash about how great Barack Obama was and how great we were and how everybody's bad. It's a pretty honest book about these issues. That was the first mistake. 2014, we should have been, I was already out of the government by then, I want to be clear. But I think the initial reaction to annexation should have been stronger. I believe that. It doesn't mean that it would have stopped what's happening today. That's the mistake people made. If we'd only done that 8 years ago, we would have avoided this. We have no way of knowing that. We have no way of knowing that. But I think we should have done more back then. We did do a lot. I want to be clear. We did more sanctions. And when I say we, I mean the free world, right? It wasn't just the United States. Angela Merkel was a leader in the European, in the EU. Those were the most comprehensive sanctions against Russia ever until this week. And they responded, by the way. That's why I'm on the sanctions list, right? It was a tit for tat thing, and that's how I ended up on the sanctions list. But I would have done more. In particular, I think it was a mistake by President Obama. President Obama, my boss of 5 years, who I think was a fantastic president, and I'm about to host him at Stanford next month, so I better be careful what I say. But I think
Don't take him to a basketball game, just saying. I'll tell you that story I didn't. Yes.
Okay, we've had a rough year at Stanford on basketball, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. But I say that because I just think it was a mistake not to provide lethal assistance in 2014, and I give the Trump administration credit for doing that. And that gets me to the second question. I've said correlation is not causation a couple of times. That's a correlation. That is not causation. And let me explain why. First, the Trump administration did do some good things on sanctions, I would say military assistance in particular. But I know for a fact, because some of his former colleagues work with me now at the Hoover Institution, the president never supported that. And again, you don't have to believe me. Go read what he said about President Putin. Go read what he said about President Putin 5 days ago. There are very few things that President Trump was consistent on. His affinity for President Putin was one of them, all the way through it. He didn't support those things, the sanctions the Congress made him do. So there's a gap between Trump and his administration. But the second thing, I think it's important to remember, and it's part of why we have to hold people accountable for where we're at now. I hope we haven't forgotten why the president was impeached the first time. It was about military assistance to Ukraine. He held up military assistance to Ukraine, the quid pro quo, to try to be reelected. The very assistance that has not been enough, in my view, since then. And if the Biden folks are getting it going, but think about that. Had we been doing more through that period instead of tying it up, there might have been a different outcome there too. And the last thing I would say, actually, I won't say it. I just realized that's enough on Mr. Trump. Let's move to something.
So, well, let's get us out of this mess, which is the future. So it seems to me that this can end in one of three ways. One is that Zelensky is defeated because Putin keeps going and escalating to the point where they flatten Kyiv. The other is an Ides of March kind of moment where Putin's inner circle says we want out, and they invite him to retire. The third way is that there's some exit ramp for Putin. So what is an exit ramp that could be constructed for Putin that he would go over, that we could impose or persuade the Ukrainians to accept? That strikes me as the toughest analytical problem in the administration today. And what advice do you have on that?
Well, first, I think your three scenarios is right. Those are the three available. And the third one is the one we have some most control over. We don't have much control, but that's where we can do something. And when I get the chance to interact with the Biden administration, these are all people I worked with in the Obama era, it's mostly discussing exactly that. Like, how do you sue for peace? How do you figure out an off-ramp for him? I'm not optimistic. If I'm putting on my analytic hat, I'm not optimistic. I fear that Putin has decided to double down, and when you listen to his rhetoric, it's scary. So if I were working for the intelligence community, that's what I'd be telling policymakers. But as I was just writing tonight before coming over here, the job of a policymaker is not odds making. The job of the policymaker is to move those odds in ways that are good for our national interests. And so if the odds are low, you got to do everything in your power to raise them in some way. And I think some kind of signal, a trade about sanctions for withdrawal is all that's available. And you can tell how I'm hesitating. I'm not optimistic that will happen anytime soon. I fear option one is where we're going. I fear that it will take losing the war before, as you know better than I, lots of wars end in stalemate. You have to get to that stalemate. Putin doesn't think he's at that moment. And before we go to questions, I want to make one thing crystal clear about my analysis of Ukraine. I am 100% convinced that Ukrainian people will never submit to a puppet regime from Vladimir Putin. There's just no way that will happen. What I don't know is how long, whether he does seize the capital and try to put somebody in place. That could happen. I just don't know how long the resistance will take before that regime falls, but it will be resistance. There will be violence. There will be guerrilla warfare in a European capital. I want you to think about that. In a European capital of 3 million people, that will go as long as that regime is there. There's just no doubt in my mind. There will also, next to that, be passive acts of civic resistance. Not everybody wants to pick up a gun and shoot. Not everybody has the ways to do that. I was just talking to a very prominent musician friend of mine this morning, who's out in Lviv, and he said, "Mike, I better be careful about naming people. Musician or ballet dancer, but somebody who's like, he's like, Mike, I can't shoot a gun, but I can inspire people." And he's a very prominent guy that he's loved by lots, and his job will be to inspire people. That won't stop if Kiev falls. He'll be in that fight for the rest of his life. So that I hope we can get to scenario 3 so that lives are not lost. But I know for sure that this operation to achieve alleged denazification, eventually that someday will fail.
So I'm going to ask my last question, and if you want to ask the question yourself, come to the 2 mics, one here, one there. Let me just make that your last point more personal. A lot of the students in the room, this is the first moment that that they've been galvanized by international affairs. They're too young to remember 9/11.
Right.
So this feels a little bit like their moment. What can they do? What would you have the students do? Because it feels like we're at an inflection point in history that they'll be dealing with the consequences of this for a long period of time. What can they be doing now?
That's a big question.
Besides buy your book, right? You mentioned that.
So I mean, one, I don't mean my book, and I want to be clear. Like we were joking about it. I want people to understand because we're not alone here. We got a live stream. I make pennies on book sales. I didn't write the book I wrote to make money. That's not what motivates me in life. And I'm very well compensated at Stanford. Let's be clear. This is not the way I make money. I said on Twitter the other night about my book. DM me, and if you can't afford the $9 to buy the paperback, I'll send it to you for free. I'll buy it for you and I'll send it to you. Because I do think the first thing is knowledge about the world. And the one thing one can do is literally what people are doing right here. And by the way, you guys got an awesome program. We want this at Stanford. I'm not kidding. We just had a meeting about we need that. You are lucky here that you have these kinds of programs. So be educated. There is a lot of things. I interact with the public a lot, right? Check out, just, spend a little time on my Twitter feed, @McFaul, and you'll see there's a lot of activity there. I see it as my job as an educator, not just to speak to my Stanford students, but to the best of my abilities on, these days, 2 or 3 hours of sleep to try to educate Americans and Ukrainians and Russians. But I want to tell you, there's just a lot of myths out there. There's a lot of really horrific myths. Putin's propaganda, for lack of a better word. So the first thing you should do is educate yourself about this history. Second, I'll just say what is happening on my campus, and maybe it's happening here, but and I'll tweet this out right after this event so you can find it fresh. A group of Stanford students from Ukraine have put out a Stand with Ukraine, where they aggregated. We're good at computer science stuff, so they're good at aggregating stuff, and they made a website right away in 12 different languages. It took them, it literally went up yesterday, and there are all kinds of things you can do. Little things from money to signing solidarity sheets. It's all there, and there's all of them. Maybe there's one here too. That's very concretely what you can do. And then the last thing I would say, I've had the Ukrainian students at Stanford come to my house 2 times this week. First was before the war. Second was on Sunday. There aren't that many, and I don't think we had all of them, but there were probably a dozen students there. And that time we invited other Stanford students. We have a nice house. We don't have a giant house, so we had 50 people there. Showed up. It was a 40-minute. We maxed out after 40 minutes of advertising, right? And you look at here. You can see there's demand for knowledge, and I would just say that it was an incredibly emotional evening. We started by saying, why don't everybody introduce themselves? First person that got up, he's a visiting scholar from Crimea. Narman is his name. He couldn't just introduce himself. He had to tell the story of his family, first having to flee Crimea and thinking they were safe in Kiev, and now trying to figure out how to get his 72-year-old mother and father to Poland, right? And so each one of them, and they had family from across the country. And if you're following Ukrainian events closely, it may not have been things you wouldn't know, but I can tell you it was incredibly important for them to be able to testify, to be able to feel that their community was with them. I got tons. They wouldn't leave my house, by the way. I'm getting a little emotional because it's so frightening to be. I'm just going to speak to the students I know, right? And one of them's in my class right now. It's just so it feels so horrible because this is happening to your family, and everybody's going to the basketball game, right? And you don't want sympathy from them, but it's just hard to keep marching forward and to write your when. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. You're worried that your brother is going to be killed tonight. That's what's on their mind. And they feel guilty, folks. They feel guilty. They feel like, how can I be here when this is happening to my family and friends back home? And so let me end on this with two things I want to say. One, about just showing them respect and listening was very important to them. And for any Ukrainians listening, because I know we have I don't know how big an audience, but I know this is a lot bigger than here. I want to just share a story from this class I'm teaching. It's a class about political mobilization and democratic breakthrough or not, ironically. And we go through cases, right? We do theory first and we go through cases. The first case we started with was with South Africa. And for each session, we call them witnesses to history. I know people that have been in all the cases. And we start with somebody and our students just to get to ask them questions. And so we started with South Africa, and we had one of the leaders of the youth movement in South Africa at the time. His name's Kumi Naida. He's this fantastic guy. You should look him up someday. And we were talking, because this stuff was starting to happen. And he, at the time, when things got really violent in South Africa, was studying at Oxford. That's how I met him. We were students at Oxford together. And he told to my students, and I'm telling it, this is to Ukrainian students that are feeling guilty right now. I want you to hear this. He said he was in South Africa. Michaelmas term was starting, right? You got to get back for classes. Should I stay? Should I go? And his comrade, that's the word they used together, his comrade in the struggle said, Kumi, you have to go. We need you for the future of South Africa. And Kumi was like, no, man, I have to stay. I have to fight. Because giving your life is the ultimate sacrifice that you can give to your country. And his friend said to him, don't worry about me. I don't know what's going to happen. But giving your life is not the ultimate sacrifice. He said, giving the rest of your life, if something happens to one of your comrades, that's the ultimate sacrifice. And his friend was killed 2 months later. And so for you Ukrainians that are feeling that helplessness of being here, remember, this is a long haul. You have a role to play, and if you're not going to sacrifice your life, I don't want anybody to do that, sacrifice the rest of your life for the future of your country.
That's powerful. As well as we can, we'll get through something.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here today. That's been tremendous. For all of us. My question is, going back a little bit to the past, we talked about the sanctions, we talked about Putin, we talked about what should have been done like that. But there are also like some diplomatic means that were tried back then, the Minsk agreement. And so I can't help but think what should have been done different with those agreements. Why did they fail?
Which agreements? Tell me.
Minsk.
Oh, Minsk. Oh, okay.
Could we
Yes.
have done-
Oh, great.
What was there diplomatic
Good
bargain
question.
available before? Is that your great question?
Oh, fantastic question. And I don't have a fantastic answer. We're doing great. We get fantastic questions. So let me just, I don't want to get into the history because I see long lines, but let me say two things about the Minsk agreements. One is they were done at the barrel of the gun with Poroshenko there. I've talked to him personally about it, under a lot of duress, and many Ukrainians afterwards didn't support it. And that's just important to realize it's a democracy, right? So it's not an autocracy. That's on their side. On the Russian side, the Russians never took the baby steps to do it because they liked the status quo. They thought that the status quo gave them a veto on Ukraine ever joining NATO. And by the way, they were right about that. NATO was never going to bring Ukraine in while Russian proxies were occupying part of their territory. So I don't think either side was that important. I would say one more thing. I think it was a mistake for us not to be part of the Minsk agreements. You know, this was Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. I think it was a mistake when it was set up that we were not there. And I made this argument to the Biden administration during the transition that America needs to be there. Those other two countries it's hard for them. Now everything's changed, right? Don't forget, everything's changed now. I'm just amazed at how things have especially changed in Germany. But back then, they did not have the clout, and the Ukrainians needed a country that they felt had their backs at those negotiations. And I think it would have helped had the United States been here.
Thank you for being here.
Yep.
Thank you for being here this evening. As you are aware, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is praised in America for his attempts to assassinate Hitler. Question: do you think Putin should be assassinated? Could you do it, or could you assign it to one of your students? Right?
My honest answer is no. He should not be assassinated. I don't believe in assassinations as a technique. And you know, because I'm public here, I just want to make crystal clear that I do not support assassination, and I don't know any of my Russian friends who support that. And I'm saying that on purpose because you might imagine that when I speak to Russians on the phone or in other ways, that is very dangerous for them. And I don't want anybody to somehow think that McFaul supports this and therefore his friends in Russia do, and then therefore they should be arrested. So I want to make that crystal clear. I do not support assassination. I think you're raising a bigger strategic question, which I do, was your scenario number two, which I think one needs to begin to think about. And that's very murky, and we don't have any information about that. So maybe we shouldn't waste much time on it. But I can tell you that there's lots of speculation inside Russia about will Putin be able to keep people around him loyal to him. And you know, even in the Soviet times, you know, Nikita Khrushchev was overthrown because of erratic behavior, even during communist times. That is not my prediction. Again, if I'm working for the CIA and I'm giving predictions, I think that's a low probability event. But it's that it is getting discussed so much in Russian circles is striking.
Hello, good evening. My name is Suad Muradov. I'm a student of Duke University Environmental Policy Program, but I'm actually international relations student. So I'll pose the next question. So I'm from Azerbaijan, Karabakh region. So you may know that this is a region that suffers from Russian foreign policy. And that's actually the reason why I'm asking this question. So not to say I support, I know I don't support Russian aggression, and I hate Russia, to be honest, for its foreign policy. But I believe that actually the reason why this war is happening is because of the lack of American effort to prevent it. And I wanna ask, and I wanna quote from Berkshire. So, your friend. So, United States is an offshore balancer, balancing against the rise of an Eurasian hegemon and going to war only as a last resort to thwart it. So, it's always going to war only as a last resort. But yet it promises Georgia, Ukraine, sometimes Turkey to attack Russia. So I believe you are not a peacemaker. So what do you think about this?
Well, that's not true, sir. With all due respect, facts have to matter, okay? Especially on a campus like Duke University. The United States of America has never called on Georgia or Ukraine to attack Russia. That's just not true. Never, it's never happened. We are not asking them to attack Russia. That's the argument that Putin wants you to believe. There's no, send me the data, show me the resolution that was passed in Congress that says Ukrainians should get together and attack Russia. So it's not true. I think you're raising a more important point, subtly, about the delicate space that we are in, including the President of the United States right now. On the one hand, wanting to support countries and their aspirations, their European aspirations. Remember, the revolution of dignity was not about NATO. It had nothing to do with NATO. It had everything to do with joining the European Union. That's how it started. And I know who started it. Mustafa Naim is his name. Go look it up. He was the one that said, when Yanukovych didn't sign the agreement with the European Union, that's when he said, I can't believe he's not allowing us to be part of Europe. Let's go demonstrate. So that maybe Mersheimer or maybe Putin wants you to believe it was about NATO expansion, but the historical record is very clear on that. The dilemma, though, is a serious one that we're talking about, which is, on the one hand, we want to support their aspirations, but we're not willing to go to war. And that creates an asymmetry here, and Putin understands it. It's exactly right. And again, I'll leave you with a note from a very good friend of mine the night the war started. And again, I won't name her name, but from Kiev, as we were debating the things you're talking about, right? So the Ukrainians, just so everybody understands, Ukrainians right now, they want a no-fly zone. They're pushing really hard for the Biden administration, for NATO, to impose a no-fly zone. And back then, she was saying, Mike, I can't believe we have to fight this guy alone. And so, with all due respect to our solidarity, with all due respect to the applause lines that we're going to hear in the State of the Union tonight, and I hope some Republicans will join them, and with all due respect to all the unity we've had in Europe, at the end of the day, they are alone. And that's the dilemma that we are not willing to fight. And I don't know how to say it other than that is a step that Biden, in my view, rightly hasn't taken. But that creates some rather difficult moral positions that the United States of America finds herself in.
Okay.
Excuse me, that's called buck passing.
Yeah, well,
You and I can
not quite, but it is an argument that I believe he's answered. So just
By the way, I did not understand the Mersheimer quote. Didn't say anything I didn't say. This is IR theory. I'm happy to interact with you. McFaul at Stanford.edu. You can email me.
First of all, thank you for being here. That actually leads fairly well into my question, which is that I was struck listening to Putin's justification for this war, that he seems to believe that all former Soviet republics are sort of rightfully the land of Russia. And if the eventual fall of Ukraine is, at this point, sort of fait accompli, it leads to the question, what if he chooses to go further than that? And sort of like, as we said before, chips on the table, are we actually, or I know we're part of the NATO pact and Article 5 exists, are we truly ready to risk nuclear Armageddon for, say, Latvian sovereignty, right? And is that something that we should be afraid about Putin testing in the future?
It's a great question. It's a tough question. But it gives me a chance to say something I wanted to earlier as a preface. You described rightly the relationship, the perception that Putin has with the former colonies of the Soviet Empire and the Russian Empire. And I'm saying that very deliberately because, at least on my campus, I don't know the politics of your campus, but there are some progressive circles, self-identified as progressives. I consider myself a progressive, by the way. I don't know why do they get to appropriate that word? And by the way, whoever quoted Mersheimer, why does he get to be called a realist? What is realistic about all those arguments that have gotten us into this mess? So language matters a lot, right? That makes me what? The irrealist or the naive, anyway.
liberal hegemon.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. But I think it's a really important point to understand him, but also to think about some of the assumptions that I see framed in that way, right? I'm not talking about you personally, but I see these arguments, I debate these people. Imagine just for a moment, if Great Britain mobilized 200,000 soldiers. They probably don't have 100,000 soldiers, but imagine if they did that and they showed up and surrounded Ghana. And they say, Ghana has always been part of the British Empire. What a shame it was that they left us. By the way, I went to school at Oxford only 25 years after Ghanaian independence, right? So there actually were some people at Oxford dreaming about the old glory days, now that I think about it. But imagine how would you react to that? Wouldn't that be outrageous to you? This imperial power is coming back 30 years later after declared independence. Somehow now they're claiming that their land is there. And I think those of the progressive persuasion, if you're against British imperialism and you're against Portuguese imperialism from way back when, and even if you frame these things in a way I don't, against American imperialism, how can you defend Russian imperialism? Ukraine is a colony of the Soviet Empire and the Russian Empire. They have no right to reclaim this territory now. So thank you for reminding me, by the way you framed your question. 2 years, yeah, exactly. The frame needs to be right. I fear, this is what, and this is
fight to defend NATO.
Yes, this is where history matters, by the way. This is the history young people need to know. A lot of that history I just talked about, my students don't know. I guess, they're smarter. I know. I don't know. My answer to your question is yes. I think that those are credible commitments. I think Biden has made that clear, and I want him to continue to do so. I support moving the soldiers there and more weapons there. I want to reduce to the lowest amount probability of Putin thinking about attacking one of those countries. But the reason I also think that is because I think that this is Putin's Afghanistan. I don't think he's marching on to other countries. I think he's going to be in this quagmire for the rest of his time as the leader of Russia, and therefore he will not have the capabilities to think about attacking other NATO countries. You said NATO countries, and I'm speaking specifically about NATO countries.
Okay, we're going to take one question here, and this one should be at the same time, and you'll answer both. That's all we have time for.
Okay.
So ask your question. Sorry about that. And then,
Hey, find me on Twitter, everybody online. Do @Duke, and I'll answer your question. I promise I'll do that.
I thank you both for this very engaging discussion. My question kind of relates to the last one. Can you talk a little bit, very little bit, I guess, about how you see this war affecting the relationship between Russia and its Central Asian former Soviet Republic, the XTO partners, especially after the events in Kazakhstan?
Yes.
Central Asia.
So I'm thinking a little bit about China and kind of Putin's relationship with Xi, and like me in Taiwan, like you in Ukraine. So I want to know kind of going forward, like, do you think the harsh opposition kind of rally around the flag effect in the free world deters Xi from maybe getting his fingers on Taiwan?
Two great questions. I'll take Central Asia first and end on China. I know a lot more about Central Asia than I do about China.
It's in Asia.
Well, I actually just mailed my 1,000-page book on lessons from the Cold War for how to deal with China and Russia today. But that is 1,000 pages, means it's years away from being published. Nobody should ever publish a 1,000-page book. So in all honesty, I've been spending most of my time over the last several years thinking about the Russia, China, US relationship. So I'll end on that. On Central Asian countries. The CSTO move, right? So this is an alliance. This is another thing that the Mersheimers of the world leave out. Somehow it's okay for Russia to have its alliance, and it's okay for the CSTO to be on the borders of our alliance, but we're not allowed to have an alliance. That's another little empirical fact that they leave out. Like, he never talks about that. But let's forget about Mersheimer for now. That was a powerful move. Just to remind everybody, there was demonstrations. They were peaceful. Then they became violent, and President Tokayev of Kazakhstan called for the CSTO, the alliance anchored by Russia, to come in, and they did, and it was pretty powerful. And by the way, Xi Jinping was watching. That was a powerful move. to remind everybody that when it comes to military force, they're still the regional hegemon, not the Chinese. But my sense, and I haven't had as much, I used to be responsible for Central Asia when I worked at the National Security Council, so I used to travel to that region pretty frequently. My sense is this is overreach from their perspective as well. And remember, there's lots of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan. The same when Vladimir Putin says that Ukraine is a made-up country, and you're Kazakh, compared to Kazakhstan, Ukraine is not a made-up country. Kazakhstan was formed by the Soviet Union in a much bigger way. So that would make me nervous if I was in Kazakhstan. The good news, not good news, the good news if you're a leader in that region is, I just repeat what I said, this is Afghanistan. The Soviets never invaded after Afghanistan, right? They were there forever. I see them having more autonomy. They're, what I hear from leaders of all 5 countries, especially Uzbekistan, is they just want us to be more involved. They don't like the neighborhood they're in. I would add Mongolia to that list too. They're in a pretty rough neighborhood, and they would like to see us play a greater role to help them manage the relationship between China and Russia. And again, on Xi Jinping, I'm not an expert, so I want to caveat my remarks by saying that. The way I look at what's been going on between Xi and Putin over the last several years, they're both autocracies. They both feel threatened by democracies. And by the way, they're threatened by the existence of democracies, right? There's some people that say, if we could just talk to them and say, hey, we're good with you, you're good with us, all right, we're all chill. It doesn't work that way if you're an autocrat. The very existence of democracies threatens them. And so you got to manage it. But I think it's naive to believe that they'll ever be relaxed with democracies. That I think is, again, another way that I see the world different than some of our realist friends. So it's an alliance of convenience based on that. There's a lot of asymmetry there, right? China has a lot more power, a lot more reach, a lot more status than Russia does. And it kind of reminds me, I'm a big sports fan. It kind of reminds me when teams go out and pick up some kind of over-the-hill athletes, right? Think of the Soviet Union and its great prowess, and now they were out of the game for a while, and then they came back, and they're kind of playing like they're a superpower again, but they're a bit of a hothead, and they're more, they explode. I'm thinking of Antonio Brown is who I have in mind right now, as you follow football. We want to win the Super Bowl, so let's take a chance on this athlete. Now I'm being diplomatic. And then it explodes. It doesn't work out, right? That's what it kind of feels like to me. Putin is way more erratic, way more revisionist than Xi Jinping is. He's invaded countries, folks. He's literally revised borders in 2 countries, and I get the feeling that Xi Jinping is like, what did I get myself into? Is this really the team I want to be on? It's like me and Putin against the rest of the world. Is that a place you want to be? I don't think that's a place Xi Jinping wants to be. And I think it gives him an opportunity. I'm not sure he'll take it. And people that know China better than me say he won't take it. But I actually think it gives him an opportunity to create some distance from this mess and to signal that for all of our competition, and we're going to be competing with China for the rest of the century. Of course, I agree with that. But there are different ways to compete. One is kind of basic rules of the game. And let's not go to war with each other, and let's not destroy the liberal international order. I think that's an outcome that's good for America, and I actually think it would be good for the Chinese people for sure, and I even think maybe for the Chinese Communist Party. That's not what Putin's doing. Putin's seeking to destroy the liberal international order, and he's literally, for the first time in my memory, threatening to go to war with the United States. If you're Xi Jinping, do you really want to go along with your Antonio Brown character here? Do you really want to be, with this reckless guy? I don't think that's in China's long-term national interest. And maybe that gives some, and this is a good place to end on. It's a good optimistic note to your scenario number 3. Maybe, just maybe, if Xi Jinping understands this moment we're in, it gives us hope that he could help to get to your, Professor Feaver's option 3, some negotiated solution. I'm not brave enough to predict that, but I think there could be a moment in time that he could play that role. And by the way, that might make for a more stable way of competing with China vis-a-vis the United States and China moving forward.
If Ukraine is the quagmire you fear, it will become, Putin will become Mussolini to Xi Jinping's Hitler, and a ring around, a weight around his neck as well. Well, it remains for me to thank you for your scholarship, for your public service, for your public education on NBC and Twitter, which I say Twitter and NBC. But thank you especially for coming to me. So thank you.
Thank you.